Vorith had never lost a fight. Not once. Not in 3,000 years. He had faced warships the size of cities and torn them apart with his claws before their weapons could warm up. He had walked through fire that melted steel and come out the other side without a scratch. Entire armies had turned and run the moment his shadow crossed the ground beneath them. Governments had redrawn their borders just to keep his territory off their maps. Admirals with 50 years of experience, soldiers who had never feared anything in their lives, pilots who had flown through exploding stars, they all did the same thing when Vorith appeared. They ran. Every single one of them. Every species. Every time. It was not something Vorith thought about very much anymore. It was simply the way things were, the same way the cold was simply cold and the dark was simply dark. He had been the most feared creature in the galaxy for so long that he could no longer remember a time when he had not been. The fear of others had become like the air around him. Always present, always the same, something he moved through without noticing. He lived alone on a moon called Duskfall. It was not a pleasant place. The ground was hard and gray, covered in broken black rocks that went on in every direction as far as anything could see. There were no trees. No water on the surface. The sky was a pale, washed-out color that never quite managed to be blue. The wind came from the north in long, flat sheets that pushed against everything and warmed nothing. Vorith liked it that way. The moon was covered in wreckage. Old ships mostly. Some of them had come looking for him on purpose, which had been a mistake. Some of them had simply drifted too close by accident, which had also been a mistake. Over the centuries the broken pieces had scattered across the landscape until they were as much a part of Duskfall as the rocks themselves. Twisted metal catching the pale light. Shattered glass half buried in the gray dust. The quiet, permanent evidence of every creature that had ever thought it might be a good idea to find out what Vorith was really like up close. None of them had enjoyed the answer. He spent his days moving slowly across the moon, or sitting still on the high ridges, or sleeping in the deep caves where the rock held a faint warmth. He did not think about the rest of the galaxy very often. The rest of the galaxy did not come near him, and this arrangement suited everyone involved perfectly well. That was how things had been for a very long time. That was how things were on the morning the shuttle fell out of the sky. Vorith heard it before he saw it. A sharp, tearing sound high up in the atmosphere, the particular noise of something going wrong very fast. He lifted his head from where he had been resting on the south ridge and watched the streak of light come down. It was not a weapon. Not a probe. It was a small ship, tumbling slightly as it fell, trying to correct itself and mostly failing. It hit the ground about 2 miles from where he was sitting. The impact sent a low vibration through the rock beneath him. A plume of gray dust rose into the pale sky and drifted slowly sideways in the wind. Vorith watched it. He did not move immediately. There was no need to hurry. Whatever had just landed on his moon was not going anywhere. He had seen this before. Ships coming down hard, crews surviving or not surviving, the wreckage becoming one more piece of the landscape. It happened every few decades. Someone's navigation failed, or their engines gave out, or they simply miscalculated and found themselves somewhere they absolutely did not want to be. They were always terrified when he arrived. He stood up slowly, stretched his wings once, folded them back, and began walking toward the dust cloud. The ground crunched under each step. The wind pushed against his scales and did nothing to them. He was in no hurry. The shuttle had come down hard but not catastrophically. The hull had held together. The landing struts on the left side had collapsed, so the whole ship was tilted at an angle, leaning against a cluster of large rocks that had stopped it from rolling further. A long black scar in the gray ground showed the path it had taken after first contact. Vorith stopped about 100 meters away and looked at it. Small ship. Civilian markings. Human design, he recognized the style, a mid-range exploration class, the kind that scientific teams used when they were going somewhere that was not considered dangerous. Someone had made a very serious error in their route calculations. He could see the emergency beacon on the hull blinking slowly, sending its signal out into the empty space above the moon. Someone somewhere would eventually receive it. That was not his concern. He took a few steps closer, studying the damage. The ship was not going to fly again without significant repairs. There were sounds coming from inside, voices, movement, the particular noise of people dealing with a bad situation. He could count at least 4 or 5 individuals from the sound alone. He waited. The door of the shuttle opened after about 10 minutes. 2 figures came out first. Adults in expedition gear, one of them holding the side of his head where something had clearly hit it, the other supporting him. They came down the tilted ramp, looked up, and saw Vorith. They went completely still. Then they scrambled back inside the shuttle so fast that one of them hit the door frame on the way through. Vorith had expected this. He watched the door close with the calm expression of something that has seen the same reaction 10,000 times and long ago stopped finding it interesting. He turned slightly, considering whether to simply leave. The beacon was transmitting. Someone would come. They were not his responsibility. This was his moon and they had landed on it without invitation, which was their problem, and the sensible thing was to walk away and let the rescue teams deal with it. He had just decided to do exactly that when he heard the small sound. Not from the shuttle. From somewhere to his left, further down the slope. A quiet sound, the kind that was easy to miss if you were not listening carefully. A soft crunch of small feet on loose rock. Moving away from the crash site, not toward it. He turned his head. A child was walking across the gray ground about 60 meters away. Small. Human. 7 years old at most, from the size. She had a torn sleeve and a bruise forming on her left cheek, and she was walking with no particular direction in mind, the way children walk when they are shaken and do not quite know what to do with themselves yet. She had not seen him. Then she looked up. She saw him. Vorith prepared himself for the screaming. Children screamed. That was what they did. Adults at least sometimes managed silence before the panic took over, but children screamed first and thought later, and this child was standing 60 meters from the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy on a cold and broken moon with no one nearby to help her. She did not scream. She stopped walking. She looked at him. Her eyes were red from crying. She had been crying before she saw him, he realized, which meant the fear on her face right now was already mixed with something else, something that had been there before he arrived. She looked at his face the way almost nothing ever did. Not at his claws. Not at his size. At his face. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her expression did something he had not seen in 3,000 years of being looked at. It softened. Not into relief, she did not know him well enough for relief. Not into wonder. Into something quieter than that. Something that had no weaponry in it at all. She took one step toward him. Then another. She stopped a few meters away, close enough that he could see the dried tears on her face and the small cut on her chin and the way she was holding her arms around herself against the cold. She looked up at him. "You look lonely too," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not performing bravery, she was simply saying what she saw, the way children say things before they learn to stop themselves. She had looked at the most feared creature in the galaxy and she had not seen 3,000 years of destruction. She had seen someone alone. Vorith stood completely still. He had faced armies. He had faced weapons built specifically to kill him. He had faced the cold silence of a moon that had once had other voices on it and had slowly gone quiet. He had never, not once, faced this. He had absolutely nothing to say. The wind moved across the gray ground between them. The emergency beacon on the broken shuttle blinked slowly behind her. The pale sky stretched over both of them, indifferent and wide. Vorith did not move. And for the first time in 3,000 years, neither did he leave. Rosie had a way of filling silence. Not aggressively, not in the way some people do when silence makes them nervous and they talk just to cover it. She filled it the way a small fire fills a cold room, steadily without forcing anything, simply by being present and warm. She talked because she had things to say, and because talking felt better than standing in the cold on a broken moon feeling scared, and because the enormous creature in front of her had not eaten her yet, which she had decided to take as a good sign. She found a flat rock about 4 feet from Vorith's left foreleg and sat down on it. He watched her do this with an expression that no living creature had ever seen on his face before, because no living creature had ever given him reason to make it. It was the expression of something very old and very dangerous trying to understand something very small and completely unexpected. She sat. She looked around at the gray landscape for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "My name is Rosie," she said. "What's yours?" Vorith said nothing. "Okay," Rosie said, accepting this without any particular disappointment. "That's all right. You don't have to talk." She reached down and unclipped the small emergency kit from her belt. It was a standard issue kit, the kind all children on exploration vessels were required to carry, a compact thing with a few basic supplies inside. She opened it and looked at the contents. One small ration bar. A basic medical patch. A foil emergency blanket folded into a square the size of her palm. A tiny light. She took out the ration bar and looked at it thoughtfully. Then she broke it in half. She placed one half carefully on the flat rock beside her. She looked at it. She looked at Vorith's claw, which was resting on the ground about 4 feet away from her and was, on its own, approximately the size of the rock she was sitting on. She leaned forward and placed the half ration bar in the general direction of the claw. "I know it's probably not enough," she said in the reasonable tone of someone acknowledging a practical limitation. You're very big. But it's what I've got. Vorith looked at the small piece of food sitting on the gray ground near his claw. He did not eat it. He was a creature that had survived on the raw material of storms and deep rock for 3,000 years and had no use for a half portion of a human ration bar. The offering was, by any measurable standard, completely meaningless. He did not move it away. Rosie ate her half slowly, looking around at the landscape while she chewed. She studied the broken wreckage in the distance. She looked at the pale sky. She looked at the rocks. She looked at Vorith in the calm, open way she had been looking at him since she first saw him, without the flinching, without the wide-eyed terror he was accustomed to receiving from things that looked his way. It's very gray here, she observed. Vorith had lived on Duskfall for over 1,000 years. He had never thought about the color of it. Our moon at home has more brown, Rosie continued. And there are craters you can see from the ground on clear nights. My dad showed me the names of them once. She paused. He has a head wound right now from the crash. The medkit is with the crew. He'll be okay though. She said this last part in a slightly different tone, quieter, more careful, as though she was saying it to herself as much as to him. Vorith listened. He had not listened to anything in a very long time. Not really listened, not the way you listen when the words are landing somewhere and staying there. Sounds reached him constantly because his hearing was sharp enough to pick up the vibration of rock cooling in the dark, but sounds and listening were different things. He had stopped listening to anything years ago because there had been nothing worth the attention. He was listening now. Rosie talked for a long time. She talked about the planet they had been traveling to, which her mother had described as having a purple sky at sunset and plants that grew sideways instead of up. She talked about school and about a project she had been working on about deep ocean creatures on Earth that had lights built into their bodies. She talked about her rabbit, Buttons, and about how Buttons had a habit of rearranging his bedding every morning into a very specific shape that no one in the family had ever fully understood. She talked without any expectation that he would respond, and this was, though she did not know it, one of the most unusual things about her. Every other creature that had ever been near Vorith had wanted something from the interaction, to survive it, mainly, but also to understand it, to categorize it, to find some way of navigating it safely. Rosie did not appear to want anything from him except, perhaps, company. She was talking to him the way she might talk to a very large and quiet friend who was comfortable with silence on their end. Vorith had never been anyone's friend. He was not sure what to do with the feeling that sentence left behind. After a while Rosie got up from the flat rock and began exploring the terrain nearby. She did this with the natural curiosity of a child who has processed the immediate crisis and is now looking for something to do with her hands and her mind. She climbed over a low shelf of rock, looked at the underside of a piece of old wreckage that had half buried itself in the ground years ago, found a stone with an interesting shape and put it in her pocket. Vorith watched her move around. He did not follow her. He simply turned his head to keep her in his line of sight, which was something he did automatically without deciding to. She was about 30 feet away, picking her way across a patch of uneven ground, when her foot caught on a loose cluster of small sharp rocks. She went down suddenly, not badly, not dangerously, just the quick hard drop of a stumble on rough ground. She sat where she landed, looked at her knee and saw the fresh scrape running across it. She did not make a big sound. She did not cry out or shout for help or perform the injury for anyone watching. She simply sat on the cold ground on a broken moon, far from home, with a scraped knee and a father with a head wound and a shuttle that was leaning against a rock at a bad angle, and she cried the way people cry when there is no particular audience and everything has simply added up to too much. Quietly. Privately. Just the tears and the small catch of breath and the effort of a child trying to hold herself together and not quite managing it for a moment. Vorith went very still. He had watched things suffer before. He had watched battles end badly and ships go down and creatures face the last moments of their lives. None of it had moved him. He had made his peace with that coldness inside himself centuries ago and he did not think about it anymore. The sight of this small child crying alone on the gray ground did something to him that he could not name and did not know how to stop. It was not pity exactly. It was something older than pity and less comfortable. Something that reached back past all the centuries of walls he had built and pushed on something underneath that he had forgotten was there. He did not go to her. He did not speak. He was not sure he had the right to do either. But the wind had been coming from the north all day in those long flat sheets, pushing cold across everything on the open ground. Vorith shifted. Slowly, deliberately he moved his body, just enough, just the right angle, so that the bulk of him stood between Rosie and the direction the wind was coming from. The cold dropped around her immediately. Rosie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked up. She noticed the difference in temperature without fully understanding it. She looked at Vorith, who was looking somewhere else entirely with the careful expression of something pretending it had simply moved for its own reasons. She looked at him for a moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She wiped her face one more time, got carefully to her feet, and walked back to her flat rock and sat down. After a moment she said, in a voice that was almost back to its usual steadiness, "Thank you." Vorith kept looking at the middle distance. The wind stayed blocked. The ration bar sat untouched on the ground near his claw, and the pale sky stretched over both of them, and something that had been frozen in Vorith for a very long time sat in the new quiet and did not quite know what to do with the warmth. The beacon had been transmitting for 16 hours. At the nearest outpost, the duty officer who received the signal checked the coordinates 3 times before he did anything else. Then he checked them a 4th time. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment because the coordinates placed the down shuttle on Duskfall, and Duskfall meant Vorith, and Vorith meant that whatever he did next was going to be the most uncomfortable decision of his career. He sent it up the chain with a single note attached. Said, "Confirmed. Please advise." Within 2 hours, 12 ships had been pulled together from 4 different species. It was a good fleet. Experienced crews. Serious equipment. The kind of assembled force that could handle almost any rescue operation in the sector without difficulty. They gathered at the edge of the dead zone surrounding Duskfall and stopped. Nobody gave the order to hold. Nobody needed to. Every captain on every ship looked at the same sensor reading, saw the same life signature on the surface of the moon, and made the same quiet decision to wait for someone else to speak first. Admiral Kress, commanding the fleet from the lead ship, had fought in 6 wars and had never once ordered a retreat out of fear. He called a council of all captains and they talked for 4 hours. The debate went in circles. The crew of the shuttle was alive. The short-range fragments still transmitting from the damaged communications array confirmed that. The rescue fleet was sitting 12 minutes of flight time away. Every minute they waited was a minute the survivors were on a cold moon with a damaged ship and limited supplies. But Vorith was there. And Vorith had never, in recorded history, allowed anything to land on Duskfall and leave again in one piece. What finally moved Admiral Kress was a fragment of sensor data that one of his analysts pulled from the transmissions. It was low quality, partial, barely readable. But it showed a heat signature from the crash site that did not match any of the shuttle's systems. It was Vorith, sitting still, next to the shuttle, not moving, for 16 hours. Admiral Kress looked at this information for a long time. Then he gave the order to move in. 2 ships went first. Slow approach, no weapons warm, peaceful signal broadcasting on every frequency they carried. The other 10 held back and watched. The first shuttle touched down 300 meters from the wreckage of the Kala. The ramp came down and the response team moved out fast and low, full gear, years of training directing every step. They crossed the gray ground quickly, came up over a low ridge and stopped. Every single one of them stopped at exactly the same moment. Vorith was there. He was facing them. He was not crouched. He was not spreading his wings. He was simply standing between them and the crash site, looking at them the way a locked door looks at someone who does not have a key. Behind him, slightly to the left, they could see the tilted hull of the shuttle. They could see figures moving inside through the cracked viewport. The team leader raised his fist. The team froze. Nobody breathed. Vorith looked at the armed soldiers in front of him. He looked at their weapons, which were raised but not yet pointed at anything specific. He looked at the equipment, the ships, the careful formation of people who were doing everything right and were still clearly terrified. He did not move. The standoff lasted 30 seconds, which felt, to everyone involved, considerably longer. The team leader was running rapid calculations in his head, none of which were producing a comfortable answer, when a small voice came from somewhere behind Vorith's left foreleg. "Is that them? Did they come?" Rosie appeared. She came around the side of Vorith's leg with her emergency blanket still wrapped around her shoulders and her hair pushed sideways by the wind, and she looked at the armed response team with the expression of someone who had been waiting and was relieved the wait was over. She looked at Vorith. She looked at the soldiers. She seemed to understand the situation in about 2 seconds in a way that cut through every complicated calculation anyone else was running. She stepped forward in front of Vorith, facing the team. "It's okay," she said to both sides at the same time. "We're friends." The team leader made a decision. He lowered his weapon. After a moment, the rest of the team followed. Vorith watched this happen. He did not move from where he was standing, but something in the rigid set of his posture shifted slightly, not relaxing exactly but settling the way something settles when a situation resolves the way it should. The shuttle door opened. George Whitmore came down the ramp first, moving as fast as his head wound would allow, which was faster than the medic behind him thought was wise. Lena was right behind him. They had been watching through the viewport and had seen Rosie standing in front of the response team, and the sprint across the gray ground between the shuttle and their daughter was the fastest either of them had moved in years. Lena reached her first. She caught Rosie in both arms and held on with the grip of someone who has spent 16 hours being terrified and is now converting all of that terror directly into the physical act of not letting go. George arrived a second later, pale and unsteady, and wrapped his arms around both of them. Rosie let them hold her. She pressed her face against her mother's shoulder for a moment. Then she turned her head and looked at Vorith. He was still standing where he had been, watching the reunion with an expression that was difficult to read but impossible to look away from. His copper eyes moved over the three humans holding each other on the cold gray ground, and something moved through them, slowly, deeply, like light moving through very old water. Lena looked up over Rosie's head. She saw Vorith properly for the first time, without the viewport between them, without the distance. Every instinct she had activated at once. She went completely still. Rosie felt her mother stiffen. She took Lena's hand. She said, quietly and with complete confidence, "He kept me warm, Mum." Lena looked at the most dangerous creature in the galaxy. She thought about her daughter, alone on a cold moon for 16 hours, and the heat signature on the sensor data that had shown Vorith sitting beside the crash site without moving. She thought about what that meant. She nodded at him. Small, careful, sincere. Vorith looked at her. Then he looked away, in the manner of something that has received something it does not know how to hold and is giving itself time to work out what to do with it. The medical teams moved through the site efficiently. Captain Noel was helped out with his ribs wrapped and his pride mostly intact. The crew was checked, treated, guided toward the rescue shuttles one by one. The operation that had looked impossible 6 hours ago was resolving itself with professional calm. Rosie walked with her parents toward the waiting shuttle. She held her mother's hand on one side and her father's on the other. The ramp was ahead of them. Warm light came from inside the ship. She could hear the medics talking, the quiet, efficient sounds of a rescue completing itself. She stopped. Her parents felt her stop and looked down. She was looking back across the gray ground toward where Vorith stood, still in the same place, watching them leave. The rescue teams moved around him carefully, giving him a wide perimeter, nobody looking directly at him for longer than they had to. Rosie let go of both hands. She turned around and walked back. The soldiers near the perimeter saw her coming and did not know what to do. No protocol covered this. No training had prepared any of them for a small girl in a torn sleeve walking calmly back toward Vorith while an entire rescue fleet watched on camera. They looked at each other. They stepped aside. Rosie walked up to Vorith and stood in front of him and looked up. He looked down. She reached out with both hands and wrapped them around the very tip of his claw, one enormous talon that was longer than her whole arm, and held on the way you hold something when you want to say something that words are not quite big enough for. She held on for a moment. Then she looked up at his face and said, "Thank you for not being scary." Vorith was the most feared creature in the known galaxy. He had been the most feared creature in the known galaxy for 3,000 years, and there was not a single species in the galactic community that would have described him as anything other than terrifying. He did not correct her. Rosie let go. She turned and walked back toward her family and the waiting shuttle and the warm light of a ship that was going to take her home. Vorith watched her go. And then, with the slow deliberateness of a mountain deciding to move, he lowered his head. All the way down. Fully. Without hesitation. The way something bows when it means it completely, not out of defeat, not out of surrender, but out of a recognition so deep and so genuine that there was no other way left to express it. Every camera caught it. Every feed transmitted it. Across 12 ships, across the outpost, across every network it reached in the hours that followed, the galaxy watched the most feared creature alive bow to a child. And every species that saw it went completely silent. Because nobody, not one diplomat, not one general, not one scholar with a lifetime of study behind them, had a single word for what they had just witnessed. The footage was 11 seconds long. That was all. 11 seconds of a large gray moon, a rescue operation in the background, and one enormous creature lowering its head slowly and completely toward a small human child walking away from it. 11 seconds with no music, no commentary, no dramatic framing. Just the raw feed from a rescue team helmet camera, shaky at the edges, the wind audible in the recording. It spread across the galaxy in 6 hours. Not because anyone pushed it. Not because any network decided it was important and put it on their front page. It spread the way things spread when they touch something that every species, regardless of their history or their biology or their politics, recognizes without being able to explain. Someone sent it to someone else. That person watched it and sent it to 3 more people. Those 3 people sent it to 10. By the time the rescue fleet had returned to the outpost, the footage had reached star systems that the crew of the Kala had never visited and would never visit in their lifetimes. People watched it once and then watched it again. That was the thing nobody could fully explain. It was not the kind of footage you watched and then set aside. Something kept pulling people back to it. They would finish watching it, sit with it for a few hours, and then find themselves opening it again. Watching that slow, deliberate bow one more time. Trying to find the moment where it made complete sense. Never quite finding it. Watching it again. The 11th second became the most replayed moment in galactic broadcasting history within 72 hours. The military analysts were the first to respond publicly, because they had the most urgent reason to. For decades, every major species with a defense program had built some portion of that program around a single fixed point, Vorith. Not around defeating him, because defeating him had been quietly removed from the category of realistic goals a long time ago. Around understanding him well enough to predict him. To map his territory. To know where he was and what direction he was likely to move and how to stay out of his path. The entire framework rested on one assumption. Vorith was constant. He did not change. He did not respond to anything except threat, and even then he responded with destruction rather than engagement. He was, in the language of military planning, a permanent environmental hazard. Like a black hole or an unstable star, something you accounted for and navigated around, not something you negotiated with or understood on any deeper level. The footage made that framework unusable. A creature that would shelter a child from the cold for 16 hours and then bow to her as she left was not a permanent environmental hazard. It was something else entirely. Something that none of their models had a category for. Senior analysts sat in rooms across multiple species and stared at documents they had spent years building and tried to find a way to make the footage fit inside them. They could not. Several of those documents were quietly filed away and not replaced, because nobody could agree on what should replace them. The conversations that happened in those rooms were some of the most uncomfortable conversations those analysts had ever had, not because anyone was angry but because everyone was facing the same unsettling realization at the same time. They had been wrong about something enormous. And they had been wrong about it for a very long time. The debate networks were louder and less disciplined than the military rooms, and they ran the footage on a continuous loop in the corner of every discussion for 3 weeks. Every species had an opinion. The opinions covered an extraordinary range. Some argued that the bow was a threat display that had been misread by species unfamiliar with dragon body language, that lowering the head was a predatory signal, not a respectful one. This theory was examined seriously for about 48 hours before enough experts pointed out that Vorith had spent 3,000 years demonstrating his threat displays on various ships and settlements and that none of those demonstrations had looked anything like what happened on Duskfall. Some argued that the child had somehow manipulated Vorith without knowing she was doing it, that humans had an unconscious biological signal, a scent or a frequency, that triggered protective responses in large predatory species. This theory lasted slightly longer before biologists from 4 different species explained, with varying degrees of patience, that this was not how biology worked. Some argued that Vorith had simply been having an unusual day and that the footage was being dramatically overinterpreted. These people were mostly ignored. The most honest responses were the ones that simply said, "We do not know what this means and that uncertainty is worth paying attention to." Rosie went back to school. Her teacher, a calm and practical woman named Miss Alderton, handled the situation the way good teachers handle all difficult situations, by refusing to make it strange. She did not ask Rosie to speak to the class about what had happened. She did not treat her differently. She made sure that the other children were not given the opportunity to make it into something overwhelming, and she kept a quiet eye on Rosie from a distance in the way that good teachers keep quiet eyes on children who have been through something. Rosie sat in her usual seat and did her usual work and ate lunch with the same 2 friends she had always eaten lunch with. She did not talk about Duskfall very much. When people asked her about it, she answered simply and then changed the subject, which was her mother's approach to most things and one she had absorbed without knowing it. At home, the family communication screen showed a constant stream of messages that George and Lena had stopped reading after the first day. Interview requests. Delegation inquiries. A formal letter from a species called the Savath asking whether Rosie would be willing to address their Cultural Studies Council via remote link. Lena had written back politely that Rosie was 7 years old and had schoolwork to finish. One afternoon Rosie sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and some colored pens and drew a picture. She worked on it carefully for a long time, getting the size relationship right, the enormous figure on one side, the small figure near its claw. She was not a particularly skilled artist, but she knew what she was drawing, and that was enough. She wrote a message on the back in her careful, slightly uneven handwriting. She gave it to her mother without saying very much about it. Lena looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter. Then she did something that felt slightly absurd and completely necessary. She folded it into an official diplomatic envelope, which was the only channel that technically existed for communicating with a being who had never previously accepted communications from anyone, and she sent it. On duskfall, the supply drone arrived 2 weeks after the drawing. Vorith watched it come down. He could have destroyed it before it cleared the upper atmosphere. He let it land. He walked over to it slowly, looked at what it had delivered, and stood very still for a long time. The drawing. A small soft toy, the rounded, simple kind made for young children, with a brown body and long ears. Buttons, he understood, was a rabbit. This was not Buttons. This was a representation of Buttons, sent by a child who had thought about what she could give to someone on a cold moon and had decided that a picture of her rabbit was the right answer. There was a note with the drawing. He read it. It said, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven and completely sincere, "I hope you are not lonely anymore." Vorith placed the drawing on the flat rock where Rosie had sat. He placed the small toy beside it. He did not examine them further. He simply left them there on the rock, where the pale light of duskfall sky fell across them in the long quiet hours. He did not destroy the drone when it left. The Galactic Council met in emergency session 4 weeks after the rescue. The agenda item that had pushed everything else aside was listed in the formal record as the question of humanity. It was not open to public broadcast. The transcript was leaked within 48 hours, because transcripts of important things are always leaked within 48 hours. What the transcript recorded was a council that had run out of its usual frameworks and knew it. Species after species taking the floor and saying, in different languages with different histories behind them, the same essential thing. We thought we understood humans. We had them measured and categorized and placed in the correct column of our assessments. They were a species of moderate technology, moderate military capacity, moderate significance. And then a child with no weapons and no training and no plan sat down next to the most dangerous creature in the galaxy and shared her food with it. And the most dangerous creature in the galaxy blocked the wind for her while she slept. The question on the table was not really about Vorith. It had never been about Vorith. It was about what kind of species produces a child who does that instinctively, without thinking, without fear, simply because she looked at something alone and decided to sit with it. Nobody in the chamber had a clean answer. But for the first time in the Council's long history, every species in the room was asking the same question at the same time. And that, the eldest members of the Council would say later, was where everything began to change. Representative Harlow was not an impressive-looking man. This was something people noticed when they first saw him and then felt slightly guilty about noticing, because it was not the kind of observation that reflected well on the observer. He was not tall. He was not broad. He had a quiet face and unremarkable clothes and the kind of posture that suggested someone who had spent 30 years sitting in meeting rooms and had made peace with it. He did not walk into spaces with the energy of someone who expected to be looked at. When he entered the council chamber on the morning of the third day of debate, most of the assembled representatives did not look up. He found his seat in the human delegations section, which was a modest allocation of space in the lower tier of the chamber, and he sat down and opened his notes and listened. He had been listening for 2 full days. He had not yet spoken. This was unusual enough that a few of the longer-serving delegates had begun watching him with the particular attention you give to someone who is waiting for something and clearly knows when it will arrive. The debate on day 3 was louder than it had been on days 1 and 2. The Kavari delegation was making their case again, more forcefully this time. The Kavari were an old species, older than most in the chamber, and they had a long history of careful, structured thinking about other civilizations. Their representative was a tall figure with pale gray skin and the precise movements of someone who had been trained since childhood to present arguments clearly. He said that the footage from Duskfall was being misread. He said that one incident involving one child and one unusual response from Vorith was not sufficient data to draw any conclusions about humanity as a species. He pointed out, with documentation that was accurate and thorough, that humans had their own long history of conflict, cruelty, and failure. He said that the Council was in danger of making a significant analytical error by treating a single emotional moment as though it revealed something fundamental. He was not wrong about the documentation. Human history contained exactly what he said it contained. Several delegates nodded. The argument was reasonable. It was structured. It fit inside the frameworks that everyone in the room was comfortable with. Harlow wrote something in his notes. 2 more delegations spoke. The debate moved through its familiar patterns. The chamber had the particular energy of a conversation that was going in circles and knew it but had not yet found the exit. Then the floor was given to the human delegation. Harlow stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the chamber once, calmly, without performance. Then he spoke. He said, "You are trying to explain a 7-year-old girl." The chamber went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something lands differently than expected. He said, "The delegate from the Kavari Council is correct that human history contains conflict and cruelty and failure. Every species in this room has a history that contains those things. That is not what we are here to discuss." He paused. "You are here because a child saw something alone and walked toward it, and you cannot make that fit into any of your documents." He looked down at his notes for a moment. Then he looked back up. "I cannot explain Rosie Whitmore to you," he said. "What I can tell you is that she is not remarkable. She is not a specially trained child or a prodigy or an exception. She is an ordinary 7-year-old from an ordinary family who did what any of our children would have done in her situation. She looked at something that seemed lonely and she decided that was the most important fact in front of her. Not the danger. Not the size. Not 3,000 years of history. The loneliness. That was what she responded to." He closed his notes. "That is not a strategy," he said. "That is not a capability we developed or a technique we trained or an advantage we engineered. It is simply what we are." He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. The transcript of Harlow's speech was in the leaked document that reached public networks the following morning. It was read widely, argued about extensively, and produced a reaction that nobody in the human delegation had fully anticipated. It sent scholars back to their archives. Not to argue against what Harlow had said. To test it. If he was right, if this was genuinely a pattern and not an isolated incident, then the evidence should exist somewhere in the historical record. Decades of contact between humans and other species, thousands of documented interactions, all of it sitting in databases that had been cataloged and filed and largely left alone because nobody had previously been looking for this particular thread. They started pulling the thread. What they found took several weeks to compile and considerably longer to fully absorb. A human medical team, operating in a conflict zone that had nothing to do with Earth, that had continued treating wounded from both sides of the fighting at significant personal risk. Not because they were ordered to. Not because there was a political advantage in it. Because the wounded were there and needed treating and the team could not find a way to justify walking past them. A human explorer named Senna who had spent 4 years on a planet whose inhabitants had responded to first contact with sustained hostility. Every protocol said to leave. Every risk assessment said the situation was not recoverable. Senna had stayed because she had decided, on no evidence that anyone could point to, that the hostility came from fear and that fear could be waited out. She had been right. The diplomatic relationship that grew from those 4 years was still active. A human child, not Rosie, a completely different child from a completely different family 20 years earlier, who had befriended an elderly Drovian on a colony where every adult had been warned to avoid all Drovian contact due to an ongoing border dispute. The friendship had produced a back-channel conversation between that Drovian elder and the colony's leadership that had quietly prevented a conflict. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had orchestrated it. A child had simply decided an old person seemed lonely and had sat with them. There were more. Many more. Small stories mostly. The kind that did not make major broadcasts because they were not dramatic enough on their own. A human saying yes when every calculation said no. A human staying when leaving was clearly the safer option. A human looking at the most difficult thing in the room and deciding that was exactly where to direct their attention. Individually, each story had an explanation. Collectively, the pattern was impossible to dismiss. Elder Corin of the Savath, who was 340 years old and had attended more council sessions than most current delegates had been alive, requested an unscheduled address. The chamber filled completely for it because Elder Corin did not request things without reason. He stood and he said that he had been reviewing his own records from 2 previous encounters with humans and had concluded that his assessments had been wrong. Not wrong in their facts. Wrong in their framework. He said, "We have spent weeks asking what Vorith saw in the child. We have been asking the wrong question. The correct question is what the child saw in Vorith. She saw someone who needed company. That was the only fact she acted on. She did not see the threat assessments. She did not see the casualty records. She did not see 3,000 years of destruction. She looked at something enormous and dangerous and ancient, and she found the one fact inside all of that which was more important than all the rest of it put together. He paused. A species that consistently finds that fact, he said, in situation after situation, across centuries of contact with species very different from themselves, is not a species of moderate significance. It is a species that has been doing something the rest of us have not been doing. And we have been too busy measuring their warships to notice. On Duskfall the days were quiet. Vorith had access to information networks through channels that officially he should not have. He had always had this access. No one had tried very hard to close those channels because doing so would have required approaching Duskfall, and the information had never previously seemed relevant to him. He read the transcripts. He read Harlow's speech. He read Elder Corrin's address. He sat with the compiled research that the scholars had assembled, all those small stories, all those moments of humans choosing the harder and kinder direction when nothing required them to. He sat with it for several days on the gray moon where he had lived alone for 1,000 years. He thought about a child sitting down on a flat rock 4 feet from his foreleg without being invited and talking to him about a rabbit named Buttons. He thought about a half-ration bar placed near his claw on cold gray ground. He thought about small hands wrapped around the tip of his talon, and a voice saying thank you for not being scary, and the way she had looked back at him one last time before the shuttle ramp closed. He composed a message. He had not sent a message to any living recipient in 400 years. He kept it short because he was not a creature of many words and because some things do not need many words. He sent it to the address on the note that had come with the drawing. In a house on a quiet street on Earth, where a rabbit named Buttons was sleeping in a warm corner near the window, a notification appeared on the family screen. Rosie read it. It said, "I'm not lonely anymore." She did not hesitate. She wrote back immediately in the same careful handwriting she had used on the note with the drawing. She wrote, "Me neither." And on a cold gray moon a very long way away, the most feared creature in the galaxy read those 2 words and felt something settle inside him that had not been settled in 3,000 years. 14 years is a long time. Long enough for a 7-year-old girl to become a young woman. Long enough for a galaxy that had been shaken by 11 seconds of footage to slowly, quietly, begin moving in a different direction. Long enough for small changes to stack on top of each other until they became something large enough to see. The galaxy did not become a peaceful place in those 14 years. It was important to be honest about that. There were still conflicts, still failures, still moments when the worst of every species came to the surface and reminded everyone how much work remained. Old fears did not disappear simply because one child had sat with a dragon on a cold moon and proved they were possible to move past. The council still met in emergency session more often than anyone liked. Border disputes still happened. Old wounds still opened. But the direction had changed. That was the thing that the historians would write about later, when they were trying to explain the period to people who had not lived through it. Not that everything became good, but that the direction changed. That the question people asked when they sat down across from someone very different from themselves shifted, slowly and imperfectly, from how do I protect myself from this to what am I not seeing about this. It was a small shift. It took a long time. It was not complete. But it was real. Human diplomatic methods had spread in the way that genuinely useful things spread, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they worked often enough that people kept coming back to them. The approach had been studied, adapted, filtered through the practical realities of other species and other histories. It did not always succeed. Nothing always succeeded. But it succeeded enough that the study of it became a serious field, and the practitioners of it became people that other species wanted in the room when things were difficult. Rosie Whitmore knew none of this in the way that people who are at the center of something rarely know it. She had grown up. She had studied. She had followed her mother's path into science, specifically xenobiology, the study of life that was not human, which felt to her like the most natural direction in the world. She was 21 years old and in her 3rd year of her degree, and she was, by any reasonable measure, an ordinary young woman with coursework deadlines and strong opinions about certain professors and a rabbit at home named Buttons who was very old now and slept most of the day. She still wrote to Vorith. Not every day. Not even every week. But regularly, the way you write to someone who is part of your life even when your life is busy and full of other things. She wrote about her studies and about things she had read and about questions she was working through in her research. He wrote back rarely and briefly, in the way of someone who had spent 3,000 years mostly silent and had not become verbose in the years since. But he wrote back. Every time. That was the part that her xenobiology professors found most extraordinary when they knew about it. Not the initial contact on Duskfall, that had been documented and studied thoroughly, but the continuation. The quiet, unspectacular ongoing correspondence between a young human student and the oldest and most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, maintained across 14 years simply because both of them had decided the other was worth staying in contact with. That, more than anything, was the thing that had no precedent. The Interspecies Convergence Summit had been in planning for 6 years. 47 species. One location. An agenda built entirely around cooperation rather than crisis management. Every previous summit of this scale had been assembled in response to something going wrong. This one had been assembled in response to something going right, which was new enough that nobody was entirely sure how to run it. The organizers had spent considerable time simply figuring out what the right questions were. The location was a neutral station, purpose-built for the summit and large enough to accommodate the physical requirements of 47 different species, which was an architectural challenge that had occupied a small army of engineers for 3 years. There were sections with different atmospheric compositions, different temperature ranges, different gravitational settings, different lighting conditions. It was, the lead architect had said at the opening ceremony, the most complicated building ever constructed, and also the most hopeful. Rosie was there because her mother's research team was presenting findings at a side panel on interspecies biological communication. She had come along as an assistant, which meant she spent most of the first day carrying equipment and setting up display materials and getting reasonably lost in the enormous station's corridors. She did not mind. She had never been particularly interested in being at the center of things. By the second afternoon she had found a quiet spot at the outer edge of the main assembly ground, a wide open space under a transparent dome that showed the stars, where she could stand and watch without being in the middle of it. She liked watching. She was good at it. It was, her mother had always said, the thing that made her a natural scientist, the ability to observe without immediately deciding what she was seeing. She watched 47 species move through the space below her. She watched careful conversations happening in doorways and groups forming and reforming. She watched diplomats who had spent careers on opposite sides of disputes standing close enough to each other to talk, not always comfortably but talking. She thought about Elder Corrin's address, which she had read when she was 9 years old and had reread several times since. She thought about what direction changing actually looked like from the inside when you were in the middle of it. She thought it looked a lot like this. Imperfect and slow and full of people trying. She had her hands in the pockets of her field coat. The stars were very clear through the dome above her. She was thinking about nothing in particular when the light changed. A shadow crossed the dome. Then another. Large, slow, the shadows of something with a very wide wingspan descending from above the station in a long careful arc. The assembly ground below went quiet the way it had gone quiet 14 years ago when footage of a bow spread across the galaxy. All at once, without coordination, every species present reaching the same moment of stillness at the same time. Vorith descended through the docking aperture that had been built, on a hopeful guess, large enough to accommodate him. He landed at the far end of the assembly ground with a sound that moved through the floor of the station like a slow wave. The nearest delegate stepped back. They could not help it. 3,000 years of reputation did not dissolve simply because the agenda said peaceful summit at the top of the page. He stood for a moment. He looked at the crowd. Then he walked forward. The crowd parted in front of him the way water parts around something large and certain of its direction. He was not moving quickly. He was not looking at the cameras that were recording from every angle. He was not looking at the delegates or the diplomatic teams or the 47 species watching him move through their gathering. He was looking, with the focused attention of something that knows exactly where it is going, toward the outer edge of the assembly ground. Toward a young woman in a field researcher's coat standing quietly at the edge of things with her hands in her pockets. Rosie saw him coming. She did not move. She did not step forward or step back. She stood where she was and watched him walk toward her through the parted crowd and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized from a cold gray moon 14 years ago. The particular feeling of something very large and very old arriving exactly where it was supposed to be. He stopped in front of her. She looked up. He looked down. The same distance between them as on Duskfall, the same scale, the same copper eyes that had looked at her across cold gray ground when she was 7 years old and crying and had decided to walk toward something lonely instead of away from it. She smiled. It was the same smile. The one that said she was glad to see him and had never doubted he would come, because she had known him for 14 years now and she understood, better than anyone in the galaxy, that Vorith did not do things halfway. If he had decided to come, he had decided completely. He lowered his head. Slowly. More slowly than on Duskfall. More completely. Every degree of it deliberate, every degree of it carrying the full weight of what had passed between them across 14 years of letters and drawings and 2 words sent back and forth across the dark between a cold moon and a small house on Earth. All of it present in the bow. All of it acknowledged. Rosie reached up and placed her hand against the side of his jaw, the way she had gripped his claw on Duskfall. A small hand against an enormous face. The same gesture at its heart. I see you and I am glad you are here, and none of the distance between what we are has ever mattered as much as the fact that we chose to close it. The assembly ground was completely silent. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single delegate lowered their head. Nobody had asked them to. No protocol required it. No signal had been given. They simply did it, the way you do something when your body understands what is happening before your mind has finished processing it. Then another. Then 3 more. Then a group. Then another group. Spreading outward through the crowd the way warmth spreads through a cold room, gradually, steadily, without forcing anything. One by one and then all at once 47 species lowered their heads. Not to Vorith. Not to Rosie. Not to the dramatic arc of the story or the cameras recording it or the history that would be written about this moment in the years to come. To the thing that had started it. The small, ordinary, unremarkable thing. A child on a broken moon who had looked at something enormous and dangerous and ancient and had found, in all of that, the one fact that mattered most. That it was lonely. And had walked toward it anyway. That evening Rosie sat outside on a low ledge near one of the station's observation windows and looked at the stars. Vorith had gone. He did not stay in crowds for long and this had been more than enough for one day. But before he left he had sent a message short as always. It said, same time next year. She wrote back without hesitating. She wrote, I'll bring better rations. Somewhere very far away, on a moon that was slightly less cold than it used to be, a creature that had spent 3,000 years being feared and alone read her message in the long quiet of the gray landscape. He did not write back. He did not need to. She already knew. She had not set out to change the world. She had only walked toward something lonely. But sometimes, in all the long and complicated history of the universe, that is exactly enough.